This presentation is recorded for the United Earth Science Collections Symposium of the Geological Curators Group on December 1st, 2022. My name is Tim Fedak. I'm the Curator of Geology with the Nova Scotia Museum, and I'll be talking about a project I've been working on over the past couple of years, looking at the history of Dr. David Honeyman, the first curator of the museum. The talk is titled Finding Honeyman and Uncovering Diversity in the History of Geology in Nova Scotia. The Nova Scotia Museum was formed in 1868, and the starting of those collections were based on those collections from the Halifax Mechanics Institute, which dates back to 1830. Today, there are over 28 sites of the Nova Scotia Museum located all over the province, and it's one of the most distributed provincial museums in all of Canada. Another important institution that formed from the Halifax Mechanics Institute was the Nova Scotia Institute of Science that formed in 1862 and continues on today. So I've been doing some historical research on the history of the Nova Scotia Museum Geology collection, looking back 200 years. So this pictorial representation of my research shows the people and institutions that were involved in or related to the collection of the museum. Those in black are from Nova Scotia, the blue bars are from New England states, and yellow from the UK or Europe. So I've been using this timeline to map out the topics that I've been looking at over the past several years, and able to zero in on certain time frames or lenses to look at patterns about interactions between people and institutions related to the Nova Scotia Geology collection. So I want to give you a little bit of a view of what's behind this diagram, or how I'm conducting my research. So this is a view of the files and resources that I've organized into a Google Drive folder that I call Historical Collections. Today it includes over 2,400 files and 14 gigs of data. And you see I've arranged the resources in chronological, year, and topical folders. So I'll give you an idea. This material includes locating and producing high-resolution images of the earliest geological map of Nova Scotia produced by Charles Jackson and Francis Algier in 1828. It also includes the history of Charles Lyell's visit to Nova Scotia, including locating samples at the British Museum that he collected that year. I've also spent a considerable amount of time looking at the 1862 International Exhibition. This is a depiction of what the Nova Scotia exhibits look like, and includes a display about the Nova Scotia goldfields, which I'll talk about more in a bit. So this Google Drive has all of the resources that I've been assembling and using for my historical research. The other thing I wanted to convey to you as a method that I've been using is the importance of digital archives that are now available. And I've been really grateful to use the Internet Archive, archive.org. And so just an example, by going there, you type in a topic or a title of a page, a paper, and a year, and you get access to these digital copies of these delicate, often rare archival documents that are available to peruse. Now, what's even more powerful, because they're digital, you can flip through the pages of these delicate, fragile, rare books, but you can also search, topical search. So here I'm looking for information about James Barnes from Nova Scotia. The search produces a quick text reading and can take you right to an area of a text that will provide information about material in a geology collection. In this case, this spine of Gyrocanthus magnificus that's over 22 inches long that's in the museum collection today. So it's these types of files obtained from our Internet Archive. You can download them And that's the sort of resources that I've been assembling together into this Google Drive. Now, once in the Google Drive, what's really great is you can do a similar search across all of these files, again looking for Barnes, and it shows me all of the files in my curated collection of historical resources that relate or mention Barnes. So this has been a really powerful way to draw things together, to build new knowledge about a historical collection, in this case the Nova Scotia Museum. So this is what's behind this depiction of the timeline and these historical topics that I've been looking at. Much of my focus has been directed at Dr. Reverend David Honeyman, who was the first curator of the museum when it formed back in 1868. And he played an important role in promoting Nova Scotia geology. He was a commissioner at the London, the Dublin, and Paris International Exhibitions in 1862 through 1867. And just really important in terms of promoting Nova Scotia geology. So that's been my main focal point, but from that I've developed and discovered other threads that are of interest to Nova Scotia geology. As an example, one of the neat discoveries I made was while looking up some information on James Barnes and looking through the Geological Magazine of 1867, I was really surprised to learn myself that John Ruskin was interested in agates. I'm interested in John Ruskin's promotion of drawing and his art theory work. So I became really fascinated by this new knowledge to me that John Ruskin was interested in geology. And when I followed up on that, I then learned about a catalog that he had produced of a collection of silicious minerals, so agates, for the St. David's School. And this catalog, again on archive.org, was able to be searched, and I happened to search for Nova Scotia, wondering if there might be anything in there. And that's when I came across specimen 31, which is this sample of gold, gold-bearing quartz, and I was able to then track this collection down and contact drawingmatter.org, and they were very gracious to send this photo of this sample of gold-bearing quartz that is described by Ruskin as coming from Nova Scotia. So then I would ask or be curious, how did John Ruskin come to have this quartz that has Nova Scotia gold? And it's that where you see the story of the 1862 exhibition and these historical documents that show Nova Scotia Premier Joseph Howe in a Nova Scotia Goldfields report of 1861. There was a major gold discovery in Nova Scotia in 1860. He's mentioning that he's taking specimens to England to promote Nova Scotia gold, and these will be part of or related to the upcoming 1862 exhibition. We also see in the Geologist magazine of 1862 a report from the Geological Society of London meeting in December 4th of 1861 that these samples and the report were received by Professor Tennant, a fellow of the Geological Society. So Reverend David Honeyman attended the 1862 exhibition. He has a scrapbook that's in the Nova Scotia archives, and we see this view into what the Nova Scotia display looked like, including this zooming in of the Nova Scotia Goldfields case and samples that were present. While at the exhibition, David Honeyman developed a great friendship with Professor Tennant, and who was at that time president of the Geologists Association. And that friendship developed into David Honeyman becoming the first honorary member of the Geologists Association that year in 1862. So many of you would know Professor Tennant was a mineralogist and mineral collector, important in British society at the time. And most importantly to this talk, he was professor at King's College, in 1853 to 69, and the president of that Geologists Association, which I mentioned, and became friends with David Honeyman in that year of 1862. That year, David Honeyman also offered a paper about describing the gold fields of Nova Scotia that was read at the Geological Society. And that paper includes this sketch map of showing the locations of the gold fields that are known in Nova Scotia at the time. So Halifax down in the bottom there on the Atlantic coast. So I became interested in other resources that might relate to David Honeyman's paper about the Nova Scotia gold fields, and therefore through that discovered that the Geological Society archives actually has several really amazing cross-sectional drawings hand done by David Honeyman, sort of large format paper copies that are still in the archives. This one showing Arisag, which was his very specific area of interest, but also includes this sheet, which has this small drawing at the bottom, which when you compare it to the sketch map of the gold fields, shows that this is the small hand-drawn drawing that David Honeyman made to demonstrate the relationships of the various strata and locations of where gold was found. So this archive shows not only David Honeyman's original geological drawings, which I had not known about before, but also this small little diagram that then became a published figure. So back to the Nova Scotia gold specimens that were sent from Nova Scotia and then received by Professor Tennant. The Geological Society also noted in their annual report that he received the report from Nova Scotia. So linking the specimens of gold of John Ruskin to of James Tennant comes about by realizing that John Ruskin was taught mineralogy from Tennant, and he described him as the best practical teaching John Ruskin ever experienced. In 1867, John Ruskin purchased a large mineral collection from Tennant for 3,000 pounds. So we have this continuity or pathway of how specimens of gold-bearing quartz came from Nova Scotia, received by Professor Tennant, likely purchased by John Ruskin. That sample then became part of a teaching collection for St. George's School and described as specimen number 31. So this Nova Scotia gold arrived and continued to be used through the late 19th century. So that's one example of how these historical threads, resources can be used to piece together the history of a geology collection. After working on this for a couple of years, I then began to ask myself, well, where's the diversity? In this case, what about African Nova Scotians and geology history? And I then did some searching and found an interesting report, a news report that was talking about George Eliot Clark, a very prominent and important poet from Nova Scotia, was going to be working on a biography of Charles Spurgeon Fletcher, who George Eliot Clark mentioned was a professor of African descent at Harvard, and he was a geologist. So I tweeted out this message in June of 2020 when I first found out about this. So I became really interested in also trying to help with this historical research of trying to uncover some of the details. And so that's what I want to share with you now, is just a little bit of a brief overview of Charles Fletcher and also Elizabeth King, another important Nova Scotian geologist who I've come to learn about through this research. So Charles Spurgeon Fletcher was born in 1896. This is a photo of Charles's father, George, in Windsor, Nova Scotia. And we first see Charles and George showing up in the 1911 census. Charles and his father are working in the gypsum quarries near Windsor. The photo from Jenison in 1911. So Charles would then marry Lydia Pleasant from Weymouth County, or Weymouth, Nova Scotia. And Lydia had been present at the first Congress of the African Baptist United Association in June of 1920. And Charles and Lydia were married shortly after, in September 1920. They then moved to Boston, and that's where this story really picks up. I actually had to do a lot of family history about Charles and Lydia to find information about their daughter, and then their granddaughter, Brenda Stuckey, who then I contacted, and she provided this clipping of an article from the Boston Globe, and it turns out to be the afternoon edition. The morning and evening editions are digitized and available online, but this afternoon edition is the only one that seems to have this story about Charles in it. And it's so this clipping that Brenda Stuckey owns, part of the family history, is the only copy that I know of. So it goes in to describe how he worked in the lab of Louis Graton in the mining geology laboratory, preparing ore samples. And Brenda was also able to provide this photo of Charles sitting in his chair that Harvard gave him when he retired. So by asking these historical questions, diving into the family history and reconnecting with family to get resources, we have together uncovered this history of a Nova Scotian man who served an important role in the Harvard Geology Lab from 1928 through 1960. So I want to also explain the power of working with these digital files and the power of Control F or Control Find, searching. And so this is an example. While I was trying to find information about Charles Fletcher, I was looking at a Harvard class of 1917 report, and I searched for Nova Scotia, and came up with this description of Harold Skinner King, which I briefly skimmed, and then was really excited to see this description of how his daughter is developing an interest in geology and being inspired by collecting minerals on the Bay of Fundy. So it was this little tidbit that I came across while researching Charles Fletcher that inspired me to learn more about Elizabeth Raymond King. And I've published an initial report on her history. Born in 1923, homeschooled by her very academically trained father and mother. Her father was also the president of the Nova Scotia Institute of Science, and Elizabeth presented her first paper with the Nova Scotia Institute of Science at the age of 12. So really interesting history. She then went on to serve with the United States Geological Survey for 60 years as a geomagnetic aerial mapper. So through that research, I also again made contact with her family, in this case her nephew who lives in California, and he then provided these 3 bound journals that contain over 400 pages of typed type notes that that Elizabeth made of her geology learning, so including her first field trip in 1932, so at the age of 9, and photos of her in the field holding a geology hammer when she was 12. And he also provided her geology hammer that she had, and photos of her father teaching her some geology at the chalkboard, here showing the granite relationship with the strata around Halifax. She's perhaps 7 years old at that point. So through this historical research, I've been able to uncover details about this really successful Nova Scotian-born woman, Elizabeth King, but also through those connections, able to get this other level of really incredible material that supports learning more about her and her life. So the other great thing with making that contact was she happened to have in her material there that her nephew provided these lithic artifacts from Nova Scotia, which have now been returned to the museum, and these are samples from the Patterson collection, which dates back to the 1870s. And Reverend George Patterson was one of the first to publish reports and descriptions about the lithic material found in Nova Scotia, again published in the Nova Scotia Institute of Science. So through all this historical research, we've also able to recover some collections that have become distributed through the years. So that's an overview summary of the methods that I'm using to do this historical research and some of the interesting stories that have been uncovered recently. There's a lot more there to talk about, but I needed to focus it down, and really want to thank everyone that has been so supportive of this research, from the archives of the various institutions, both local and international, colleagues and collaborators in University of Edinburgh, support from local colleagues at the museum, including Catherine Ogden, and Brenda Stuckey and Charles Rhines, the relatives of Charles Fletcher and Elizabeth King, who provided such valuable information.